Welcome to the Glenn Show. Welcome back again to the Glenn Show, Mark.
I'm a recidivist.
Very good, you are. And that's entirely appropriate since we're talking about crime and punishment in prisons and public policy today. So, Mark, to introduce our conversation, I'd just like to say a couple of things. You are the expert, and I am the pundit. So I really want to benefit from your expertise. We've known each other a long time, and we've been talking about these issues for a long time. And indeed, we've talked about them on Blogging Heads before, and it's gotten heated. So we're going to, at least I am going to try to conduct myself in a manner in keeping with the high standards for decorum and courtesy that we cherish here at bloggingheads.tv. And since you always conduct yourself in that way, we don't even need to say anything to you about that. But, okay. So now you've, first of all, let me just observe that the debate, the amount of press that this question of we have too many people in prison in America, what methods of policing are actually keeping cities straight, what accounts for the historic fall in crime that we've observed over the last decade more, 2 decades, what works and what doesn't work with respect to corrections and post-release supervision, and all of that. These are, have become really, really hot. You've got a book out of Princeton University Press, When Brute Force Fails, that makes a very strenuous and powerful argument that we could do much better in this area of policy than we've been doing. You've been publishing popular pieces of late. Your innovative ideas about post-release supervision are being tested around the country and are being noticed. So, I'm welcoming you, Mark, to be able to at least set the stage here a little bit for this conversation by telling us what you've been writing and thinking and what you think sort of the major questions are.
All right. Well, thanks for that kind introduction. And I should point out I wasn't alone in having a piece in Washington Monthly. Mine was more or less in response to yours.
Aha. We'll get to that.
And we'll get to that. But yes, I think we have way too much crime and way too many people behind bars. And I think we now know lots of stuff we could do that would lead to less of both. And I think the beginning of wisdom in this is to say we have 2 problems, not 1. So there are people out there still talking about the crime problem and sort of pretending that 2.3 million people behind bars is not a problem. There are people out there talking about the new Jim Crow as if 2.3 million people behind bars was a problem and 15,000 homicides a year was not a problem. And then there are people who say we got 2 problems, not 1, and we need a joint solution. And the joint solution comes in lots of different forms. It comes in learning how to manage crime through means other than punishment. For example, by reducing lead exposure, or by improving parenting performance, or by changing the way we deal with kids in schools in ways that improves their capacities for self-command. And it means changing the way we deal with people who are committing crimes by punishing them in ways that are more consistent with what we know about how humans react to things. Partly this is Back to the Future. Cesare Beccaria wrote down the principles of punishment 250 years ago. And if he hadn't written them down in Italian, we'd know his name rather than Bentham's. But he said that punishment is effective when it's swift and certain and not when it's severe. And that's hard to do in a world of due process, but we actually do know how to do it, as you say, particularly for people who have already been convicted of crimes and are now under community supervision. And I think it's now demonstrated that we can substantially reduce the fraction of their lives they spend behind bars, as well as reducing their drug abuse and their criminal activity.
Can I ask a question,
yeah.
Sir? Why is it that it's only after they've offended against our law and it comes time to punish them that we become interested in the techniques of intervention or manipulation that might foster better behavior on their part?
I don't think it's so. That's the reason I'm so interested in removing lead from the environment, improving parenting performance with something like the nurse-family partnership, teaching self-command through the good behavior game in schools. I mean, there's a long list of things we could do, even before we got to the, I think, much harder problems of building up people's individual level social capital and improving the collective social capital in poor and poorly controlled neighborhoods. I mean, as David Kennedy says, there are a lot more people in the world afraid of their mother than of the cops.
That's a clever statement. I mean, what I meant to ask, though, Mark, is whether the frame of punishment and crime is the appropriate lens through which to begin to discuss the more general concern about safety. Let me give an analogy, and I think perhaps my point will become clear. In the international security arena, there are some who say, they talk about collective security, by which they mean, you know, we got terrorists over there that may come, and so we want to build a wall or have a set of institutions and devices to protect ourselves from them. But the terrorists are also motivated by this or by that, and their political objections are part of what might be thought of as creating the insecurity in the environment in the first place. So that if I wanted security in some lasting and deeper sense, I would address not only the physical threat of them coming across with a bomb, but I would address the broader framework of claims that might be motivating them to be willing to engage in that activity in the first place. And then there are those who will say, oh, that's soft-headed and ridiculous, and, you know, first of all, their political claims are wrong, and secondly, you'll never persuade them of anything, and whatever, whatever. Okay, so there's that debate.
Well, and the third thing to say about that is, again, to echo your question, why are we only interested in their claims after they've murdered somebody? How about the political claims of people who aren't murdering anybody right now? To what extent do we want to reward murdering people by saying, oh, you killed somebody, now you've got a political claim we need to pay attention to?
Okay, I grant that that's a fair point. But I don't want to lose the thrust of,
right.
of the analogy, which was with respect to public safety in a domestic setting, what goes on in our cities, what goes on in the poorer and less advantaged quarters of our society, where we do, those of us who are making laws or who are commenting on the making of law, who are ourselves relatively safe and comfortable, have a responsibility to worry about the circumstances of, you know, people who are less fortunate than ourselves. And also, when we look at an offender, someone who's broken the law, and so the person stands in the dock, they're at the bar of justice, and punishment is an important enactment from the point of view of securing people's, confidence in the organs of government. I mean, that from the point of view of recognizing the dignity of victims and all of that stuff, I'm sure that you could talk about at great length. Why is it then that we don't think more broadly about the social, you say the environment, you point to lead and so forth, but of course there's a lot of other stuff that's at play in creating these blighted lives, this kind of sullen diffidence and indifference to, respectable social behavior. The poorly developed individuals, the psychologically limited individuals who did not acquire the practice of self-control and all the rest. These are social products, that have come about in part because of the way in which we are organized as a society more broadly. And yet we only begin to talk about intervention when it comes time to punish people. Anyway, you see what
I guess I partly want to deny that.
Yeah.
Lots of people who advocate for more social service spending of various kinds tend to throw in crime control as a make-weight in their argument. But when you look at the actual program evaluations, when you look at the way the programs are actually run, you discover that the people who are charged with improving various kinds of social conditions actually don't spend a lot of time measuring crime or whether what they're doing has impact on crime. They just sort of throw the social benefit out there and hope that crime control will arise as a result. So the question I keep asking is, all right, we think schools are an important way to teach kids self-command and therefore reduce their criminal activity. How many high school principals could tell you what fraction of their students had been arrested for a serious crime last year?
I have no idea.
Zero.
I see.
And to what extent is that used in their No Child Left Behind evaluations? Not at all.
What fraction have been arrested for a serious crime last year in a typical Central City high school?
Good question. Good question. And I really don't know the answer, but I'm sure it varies.
Yeah.
I'm sure some schools are better than others, and I'm sure that those schools are getting no reward for that. And that leads me to think that the principal probably isn't thinking very hard about what he or she could do about that. Nor is the head of the TANF office, nor is the head of the housing agency, nor is the head of the health department. Right? So somebody gets shot and comes into a shock trauma unit. And we've gotten a lot better at fixing those people up. That's part of the reason the homicide rate is down. It's not that fewer people are getting shot, it's that they're surviving it, which means we have a lot of these young men riding around in powered wheelchairs now. Okay, so but the shock trauma surgeon fixes the guy up. Now, somebody came in with a sexually transmitted disease. The sexually transmitted disease unit at that same hospital would not be satisfied with a dose of penicillin and go back out there. They'd want to do some contact tracing. They'd want to do some advice. They'd want to keep this person who's got a sexually transmitted disease from giving it to someone else. That's part of medicine. Well, it turns out that gunshot wounds are infectious. Somebody who gets a gunshot wound is very likely to give a gunshot wound if you succeed in patching them up. There are some places, like San Francisco General Hospital, where the shock trauma unit takes that seriously. And they worry not only about saving the life of the guy who's on the table right now, but saving the lives of the people that he might kill in revenge. Okay, but that's rare. That's not standard medical practice. So I think throughout our social service delivery systems, you're right, we should be asking, what could we be doing other than hurting people, which is what punishment is, that would reduce crime? But it's not the case that merely spending random money on all these social service systems is crime reducing if the people running them don't think about that, and they mostly don't. So I'm with you entirely. I want a many-faceted attack on this problem. But that starts out by saying there's a problem. I mean, your article points out the very high incarceration rate among African Americans and the very high ratio. Right? It's about 6-to-1, black to white, in the fraction of people behind bars. And you and I are both shocked by that, and you say, what sort of people are we that we do this? And I would simply say, if you look at the homicide rate, and of course almost all homicide is intra-racial, and you ask what the ratio is of homicide victimization, black to white, the answer is 6-to-1.
Your point being what, Mark? I don't see the point.
I
mean, what's the link between incarceration and homicide?
Well,
neither causes the other.
No, a lot of stuff.
Most of those people in prison are not in prison for homicide. Neither is the homicide rate much affected by the incidence of incarceration. So I'm not sure what your point is.
My point is that about half the people in prison are there for violent crime. A homicide is simply an unusually successful violent crime. And the question I'm noticing that you're not asking is the other, what sort of people are we? What are the characteristics of African American society in the United States that leads people to kill each other so much?
Well,
why isn't that engaging your denunciatory powers the way the incarceration rate is?
Hold on. It does. I'm deeply concerned about it. Okay? I mean,
right.
I don't think I need to demonstrate to you or to anyone that the level of my, concern about, fury over, deep regret for, sadness and pain in the face of the sufferings of people who live in the corner of this society, among which are included their victimization by violent criminals, but by no means are their sufferings exhausted by the list of those depredations. I actually know these people. I have actually lived among them. I have people in my family who have been fatally victimized by violent criminals. I have people close to me in my family who have engaged in violent victimization of others. I mean, none of this is, because I'm a professor at a university, because I'm left of center politically, because I write with a critical edge when I talk about the institutions of this society from the left of center, does not mean, and oughtn't to be presumed to mean, that I somehow have less of a concern about the sufferings of these people at the hands of criminals, amongst other sufferings, than anybody else. My concern would not be demonstrated by the extent to which I was prepared to advocate this or that punitive response to the behavior of these miscreants in this community, whose existence is just one of many reflections of the abandonment, neglect, and contempt for the people who live there that this society has shown. So, okay, that's my response to you, Mark.
But let me raise a question about that.
Okay.
You say their depredations are merely one reflection,
amongst others. That's the point I want to make. Yeah.
Of the social conditions. They're also among the supporting causes of the social conditions. I think it's very hard to make those places better places to live without doing something about the security of person and property. I mean, you've got the story you tell about your arrest for riding the bicycle on the sidewalk in New York City. That was a shocking story. But notice that you were riding your bicycle on the sidewalk at, what, it was 135th in Amsterdam?
It was 113th and Lenox, but close enough.
Close enough.
I mean, in fact, 113th and Lenox is worse because there used to be a huge heroin trade there years ago, and it's close to Central Park where, there people are concerned about what's going on. But but all I was doing was riding my bicycle.
Where you would not have dared to live 20 years earlier.
Correct. That's correct.
So on the one hand, you were deprived of liberty by the New York City Police Department. But that would not have been a problem for you before the New York City Police Department started doing what it's doing, because you would have been there in the first place.
Well, can I just observe that it remains to be demonstrated to my satisfaction that rousting 60-year-old college professors as they pedal along on a bicycle on some trumped-up BS ordinance about not riding a bicycle on the street, which is really an excuse to detain me, force me to produce an ID, and see if I'm carrying any weapons. What I'm questioning is whether or not that is the causal agent that has produced the change that you say has led it for me to be in that neighborhood. So I just want to raise that question.
Sole causal agent? I doubt it. I mean, an important one. Is it part of the reason that Chicago has 4 times the homicide rate of New York, that New York is better and more aggressively policed? Because I think you said the word that makes the duck come down and give you $100, weapons. Right? All that aggressive policing in New York is partly about seeing whether people have weapons.
You know what, Mark? I think some of our listeners do not have any idea what you're talking about when you say a duck comes down and gives you $100. I remember that from, you're dating yourself. But anyway, go ahead.
I'm more than dating myself, because that show was off TV before.
Yeah, I thought so. But you were alive when they were remembering that show. No one even remembers the memories of that show.
Exactly.
But anyway,
so for our younger watchers, that's the Groucho Marx You Bet Your Life show. And there was a word every week, and if somebody randomly said that word, a duck would come down and give them $100. And to some extent, the word in New York is weapon. So I don't want to endorse what NYPD is doing. I'd like to figure out whether we can get some of the benefits in reduced crime, and let's note in reduced incarceration. Right? New York City has led the country down on the rate of incarceration. Right? We're 20% below our peak incarceration rate in New York. We're about 1% below our peak incarceration rate nationally.
Mark, I don't mean to quibble, but please, let's not try to do armchair social science here. This doesn't establish anything. I simply want the audience to know that the anecdote that homicide is down in New York more than it's down in Chicago does not establish anything about the efficacy of the policing techniques that are being utilized in New York. A much more systematic and controlled examination of a larger sample of cities would be necessary to establish with any scientific credibility the causal claims that my guest on the Glenn Show today is making.
Admitted. All
Okay.
I'm saying is, if you look with horror at what NYPD does, you need to at least put the footnote in that while they're doing it, some other good stuff is happening. Now, maybe it's not strictly causal, maybe it's multi-causal, but again,
Okay.
I'm not out there, endorsing stop and frisk policing, which I'm mostly against. Right? I'm saying, wait, if somebody's been convicted of a crime and has an expensive drug problem that is very likely to keep him committing crimes, shouldn't the probation department make him stop using cocaine or methamphetamine or heroin or whatever his favorite drug is? Now that we've demonstrated that doing that actually reduces the number of days that man will spend behind bars over the rest of his life. And I'd expect from somebody concerned about mass incarceration and crime in poor neighborhoods some enthusiasm for that. Boy, there's a way of making people better off and less dangerous and improving their neighborhoods and reducing the number of people behind bars. And the response I hear from you is, oh, that's Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, it's small bore, it's incremental. It may show some payoff in the short run, but it doesn't address the fundamentals. It's a palliative. These are my instinctual reactions, but I will acknowledge that you have my attention, Professor Kleiman. You and this army of people who are out there both implementing and thinking hard about, you mentioned David Kennedy earlier, there are many others, what can be done that makes sense, that is less horrible and painful and costly in terms of human suffering than is warehousing millions of people in prisons and so forth, but that is also effective at securing greater public safety for those of us who, among us, who are, most vulnerable and least able to avail themselves of the kind of protective devices that you and I take for granted, like moving across the line to a place where we're more safe.
Right.
So you're getting my attention, and it's hard for you to not get my attention since some of the stuff that you've been promoting and advocating has been meeting with such success. So do you want to talk about that a little bit? Again, I mean, you've done this before at Blogging Heads, but what do you see as the future of, more, sensible and effective provision of public policing, public safety, punishment, and so on? Well,
again, I used to think that this really was sort of Clockwork Orange stuff, that what we're doing was making deterrence more effective. Now, as I look at the data, I have to say, no, that's too small a cause for the effect we're seeing. Right? To take 80% of a group of heavily meth-involved offenders and have them not using meth at 1 year. There's no drug treatment.
Where's that happening?
World. Huh?
Where did that happen?
That's the Hawaii result.
Got it.
That's the Hope result in Honolulu. But
wait a minute. Can you say this more? Can you say this more precisely? We're talking about people who are released from incarceration.
No, not released from incarceration. In Hawaii, they're probationers.
Oh, okay. So they've been convicted, but the sentence is to probation.
Right.
And they're being supervised.
Right.
And in the population of addicted or meth using persons in this condition.
I can't say addicted because we don't have diagnoses, but
yes,
on average they have 14 prior arrests. And these are pretty serious folks, and they were selected into the program because they kept testing positive while they were on probation.
How many?
And
how many in this sample?
There were 500 in the experiment, of whom 2/3 were experimentals and 1/3 were controls.
I see.
think that's right.
Okay.
Plenty big enough
All right. And then go on, please. You were describing.
When you took the experimental group and defined success in the following way. 1 year after the beginning of the program, they were still on probation. That is to say, they had not been sent back to prison. They had not been arrested for a new crime. And they hadn't absconded. They were actually coming in to report. And over the previous 3 months, they had had no violation of probation, which included no positive drug test, and they were being drug tested randomly, right? So that's my definition of success.
Wow. Okay.
On that definition, 80% of the experimental group counted. And I look at that and I say, no. You couldn't just get that by threats. There must be something else working here.
What was the treatment in this experimental design? What did the people in the experimental group get that the people in the control group did not get?
They got a hearing in open court with the judge who read a script that he'd made up himself, whose first sentence, interestingly, was, "Everyone in this courtroom wants you to succeed on probation." Right, so you start with a statement of goodwill. And then he went on to say probation was a deal. You did something you could have gone to prison for, but we didn't send you to prison. We put you on probation instead, and in return, you were supposed to obey some rules. But you haven't been. That's the reason you're here. So from now on, we're going to monitor whether you're obeying the rules, and every time you break the rules, you're going to spend some time in jail right away. And here's your phone number to call to find out whether each day is your day for a drug test. You have to call every morning, 5 days a week. And if you don't show up, we'll send a cop to chase you. And if you show up dirty, you'll be in jail that night.
I see. For how long?
At the beginning, he was giving a week or 2 weeks, and the one contribution that Angela Hawken and I made was say, well, try cutting it down to 2 days. And it turns out 2 days works as well as 2 weeks, works as well as 6 weeks.
Wow.
In the Sobriety 24/7 program in South Dakota, which is about repeat drunk drivers, it looks like an hour in a holding cell works plenty. So we're still finding what the minimum effective sanction is. Not sure it matters much. In New York City, on a program we're about to start called Kleiman, the first sanction is going to be a week of a curfew from 10 a.m. to 6 a.m. You have to be home at those hours. And I think that's going to turn out to be plenty. I'm not sure you even need a week. So why do I think this works? I think it works because the people who wind up in programs like this, when people who wind up in prison, mostly grew up in chaotic households and live in chaotic neighborhoods, where the things that happen to them happen mostly at random. Their capacity to control their own outcomes is very limited. And they learn that. And the result of that is that they have very poor impulse control. Why should you control your impulses if what happens to you is luck and other people's whims? And here in a small but important part of their environment, their relationship with probation, you put them entirely in control. If they keep the rules, nothing bad happens. If they break the rules, something bad happens every time right away. And my theory, we do not have data on this because there's been very little money to study this process. My theory is that we're actually changing their capacity to control their own behavior. We're changing their self-efficacy, as the social psychologists call it, or their locus of control. If I'm right about that, this is a big deal, not a little deal.
Changing
and both in.
I mean, excuse me for interrupting, but I just think this deserves to be emphasized.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
If indeed you are changing their capacity for self-command control, what a remarkable thing it would be that by imposing upon a person, basically you've drawn a line. I mean, it's as if you were talking about a kid whose parent had never told them the difference between right and wrong before and never made them sit down when they were, being disruptive or anything like that. Simply by drawing a line and having there be some relatively modest consequence of going across the line, and then endowing the individual with the opportunity to elect to not cross the line, something that they could exercise on a regular basis and then enjoy the benefits and the prideful sense of accomplishment associated with having managed to get by without crossing that line, you will have expanded their broader capacity to manage their behavior in society in a way that's less dangerous and offensive to other people. What a remarkable thing if true.
Exactly right. And I guess what I would say is none of these people have parents who didn't tell them the difference between right and wrong. But most of them had parents who would ignore most of their misbehavior and beat them occasionally. And the criminal justice system does the same thing. It ignores most of their misbehavior and every once in a while throws them in prison for a while. And so we're getting the criminal justice system to act like a halfway decent parent. And at that level, it's not so surprising that it works, particularly since what you're asking these folks to control is their drug use, which is something they feel pretty hopeless about because they don't really have the capacity not to use now when it feels really good to use now, because somewhere in the distant future they'll be better off. But they do have the capacity.
Go ahead, Go ahead. No, you finish your thought.
They do have the capacity not to use now because something bad will happen tomorrow. But once they've learned that they can actually not use meth, big discovery for them, easy to imagine that would generalize into the rest of their lives.
So the observation I was going to make, taking due note of the significance of what you're saying, was back to my clockwork orange concern, which is that, all right, we've got a set of people who've been poorly parented and have not learned some of the things that an adult needs to know in order to be able to live a satisfactory life. Now, that's true across the spectrum in society. It's true in the low income, in the high income. It's true in those who are likely to become engaged with the criminal justice system as a consequence of their chemical dependence, and of those who are unlikely to become engaged with the criminal justice system, but who nevertheless are chemically dependent. And so this in loco parentis thing that we're going to end up doing with the instrumentality of the state, with coercion and courts, is mainly going to engage with people who are at the bottom end of society. But the rationale for it, restoring to them the capacity for self-command, empowering them to be able to deal with their relationship to chemical dependency and so forth, would apply much, much more broadly. So that is to say, it could apply to me and you, Mark, even to me and you.
And in fact, we know that drug treatment programs that work on positive incentives can have very dramatic results. It turns out you can pay a meth user to stop using, and that will work. With respect to the positive incentives, there's the political issues you can imagine. With respect to coercive incentives, on what basis could you do this to somebody who hadn't broken the law? I mean, yes, lots of people might benefit from this, but on what basis could you subject them to it if they hadn't first come to your attention?
This is
somebody else's rights.
Correct, and this is in keeping with the point that I want to make, because the law is selective in the way in which behaviors end up being classified so as to occasion the intervention of the state. And the law is also selectively enforced. And the violation of the law that takes place, for example, the violation of drug laws that take place on college campuses, I just give it as one example. I'm not a Pollyanna. I'm not trying to say that there's not a real problem in public housing projects or tenement districts of cities or in rural and, so forth, whatever. I'm not saying, they're all the same, but I'm just thinking the law and the courts and punishment as the entree into this a corrective behavior for people and so forth, given that its incidence is going to, by class, race, and otherwise, be disproportionate and unequal, it makes me want to hold my wallet, so to speak. It puts me on guard. I feel that injustice lurks around the corner and so on, and so I adopt this posture that you're so disappointed in me for adopting.
Well, right, because if it turns out this is actually beneficial, the fact that it's not going to be done to other people seems to be not such a terrible thing. And if people are only, I mean, if people are being put on this program because they had been stopped and frisked by the NYPD and discovered with marijuana in their pockets, I'd be pretty appalled.
Yeah.
If they're put on this program because they were convicted of a burglary that they committed to pay for their crack habit, then it seems to me there's neither disproportion nor injustice in saying, fella, your crack habit has become our problem because you made it our problem, so you have to stop.
You prepared to promise me that it's only going to be the latter and it's never going to be the former?
I'll promise you that in a pony, but I won't deliver it. I will say that if the program is promoted by people who are concerned about that aspect of it, or elected to get better outcomes,
all right,
than if it's promoted only by the law and order types.
All right.
So, I just think I think we could do enormously better than we're currently doing. I think if you added position monitoring to drug testing, a very, very large fraction of the people currently in prison could safely be let out. And
I think people need to know position monitoring means that we're going to put an anklet and we're going to use technology to make sure that we know where people are, and there's going to be a court-enforced restraint on where they're allowed to be at particular times of day or whatever it might be, just to be clear.
Right. So that's what it means. It can be used to enforce curfews. It can be used to enforce requirements to be at particular places at particular times. It can also simply be used to make it very hard for that person to commit any new crimes.
Yeah.
Because the anklet will put him, in the apartment of the person he was burglarizing.
Right.
And if you think of that as an alternative to incarceration, it seems to me it's pretty good. Now, of course, you have to worry about a falling cost of punishment leading to net widening. But, that's a problem I'm prepared to worry about later.
The other thing I was thinking is that the bloodthirsty pro-punishment element who will bring out the victim and say, do you realize that the punishment that this guy is getting is that he has to wear an anklet and that he can't hang out with his buddies in front of the tavern at 2 o'clock in the morning? And after all, look at the damage that he's done to society or the pain that he's caused to this person, that they won't be sated. They won't be satisfied. That if we were going to take all these scumbag thugs out of prison and have them walking around with, or half of them, or 2/3 of them with anklets, that there would be an element in our polity who would find that distasteful in the extreme from a retribution point of view, not from a does it work to keep them from committing crimes, but do I feel satisfied that they got what they deserved point of view.
Right. There's certainly people who will be outraged from that perspective, as there are people who are outraged from the perspective of expanding social control. You've heard me say before that the only problem with the American criminal justice debate is it's conducted between the disciples of Michel Foucault and the disciples of the Marquis de Sade. And, I get neither the sadists nor the Foucaultians on my side on this one. But, it turns out that the bloodthirstiness of the American political system has shrunk a lot as the crime rate has shrunk. So, I think this is probably sustainable from that perspective. The other thing is, as our old colleague Mark Moore used to say, if you talk to people, these are middle-class people, about crime, and you say, what do you really want to do to criminals? The answer really turns out to be, I want them to be forced to live the same difficult life I live. I want to sentence them to a middle-class lifestyle. One of my favorite crime movies is Once Upon a Time in America.
I know it.
Right, so Robert De Niro and some of his buddies are, it's odd, it's Italian actors playing Jewish mobsters from the 20s, and they're running a speakeasy, and the speakeasy gets broken up, and they all scatter, and the movie is about their getting back together. And so De Niro sees one of his old buddies, and his friend says to him, "What you been doing?" And he says, "Going to bed early." So that's the sentence I want. I want to sentence people to go to bed early. And, I think it's going to work if we do it. And it's really hard to do. And it's going to require a lot of political energy and a lot of bureaucratic energy and some money. And on the one hand, yeah, you're right. It's been getting some attention. But I mostly wrote this down 20 years ago. And Leighton Niles and Steve Alm started actually doing it about 7 years ago. And, someday, real soon now, 1% of the people who need to be on this program are going to be on it. I mean, it's really painfully slow. Partly because it doesn't fit any of the ideologies of criminal justice. It's not mean and it's not generous.
I want to raise one more issue with you, and then maybe we can bring this conversation to a close. We can, of course, have further conversation.
Right.
Last week on the Glenn Show, I was talking with Pat Nolan, whom I'm sure you know or know of. He's a Southern Californian. He was a member of the California State Assembly. He served as 18 months. Republican leader of the State Assembly. He served 18 months in a federal prison for some corruption charges, and came out.
Finance, I think.
Came out and became a very important part of Chuck Colson's prison fellowship ministries, and is now the president of Justice Fellowship, which is a branch or affiliate of the Prison Fellowship Ministry family, and works from a Christian perspective, but with a very savvy, politically well-connected Washington mentality about getting laws passed that will be effective in this area. Anyway, the long and short of it that I wanted to raise with you was, and he's an advocate of prison reform of one kind or another, of prisoners' rights. They got involved in promoting legislation against rape in prison. They work with the families of people who are incarcerated. They are interested in, they were instrumental in promoting the Second Chance Act, which is a big piece of federal legislation providing greater support for formerly incarcerated persons after they've been released from prison. And victims' rights as well. In fact, Pat Nolan was famous when he was in the California Assembly for having been a proponent of victims' rights and having championed legislation protecting and extending victims' rights. Anyway, so this is Pat Nolan. He agrees with you.
Under the very weird interpretation of victims' rights, which is a right to have the victimizer punished rather than a right to be made whole.
Can you just explain that for a minute?
One version of victims' rights is that if somebody's victimized by crime, that's a failure of the society to the state to perform its role of protecting public safety, and therefore that person should be made whole from his losses. If he needs medical treatment, he should get medical treatment. If he needs rehabilitative services, he get rehabilitative services. If he lost property, that property should be made up to him. Okay. We don't do any of that.
Oh, I see.
Victims' rights is a political
victims'
matter.
Rights become
the right to go to court. And
to make your statement, to be present at the sentencing hearing, at the if they're going to get paroled, right. And to be able to have a voice there and so on. I see. Okay, so that's a different notion of victims' rights. Okay. Anyway, I mentioned Pat Nolan because, as I was about to say, he agrees with you and with me that too many Americans are in prison. I think he would agree with you and with me that public safety is a very high, very important social goal and whatnot. And he agrees with me, and I'm not sure he agrees with you in this respect, that when we're talking about policy in this area, and perhaps I shouldn't put it that way. There's no reason for me to presume that you wouldn't agree with this. That the moral argument, the argument that people who offend against our laws are human beings and we must never lose sight of their dignity. The argument that morality is a complex thing, and that the righteousness with which some will engage in the activity of punishment as they look at those who've offended, drawing a line, the offender on one side, the rest of us on the other.
Right.
is sometimes very misplaced, because take a look in the mirror and so forth and so on. I mean, prison fellowship promoted this idea in part because many of the principals, starting with Chuck Colson himself, and certainly including Pat Nolan and myself, I might acknowledge, because I served on the board of prison fellowships for some years during the 1990s, we had our own difficulties engaging in criminal behavior, being found wanting from the point of view of the rectitude and the social judgment. Some had served time in prison, I had not, but all of them are keenly aware of the fact that there but for the grace of God go I when we look at somebody who is in the dock, and wanting not to just turn our back on him.
And also remembering that almost everybody who's a criminal was a victim first.
Yeah.
Was a victim first.
Was a victim first, indeed. So I'm just wondering how you react to this. I mean, because you call me Jeremiah. You say that, why am I indicting society and going around raving about what manner of people are we, that we have these institutions of punishment that we've overshot, and that we only react to social dysfunction and marginality in this punitive way, where we put most of our attention and much less on a more developmental focus and all of that. And I'm saying it's part of affirming the humanity of the people who are in our custody, and it's part of pointing a finger back at society and asking, are we really so different from these people whom we're punishing? And have we lost sight of the social responsibility and social entailments that are implicated when we see individuals fail in their own lives? Sorry that must sound as soft-headed as it sounds, but I'm sticking with it. The moral.
I'm entirely on your side of that, and one of the arguments that I make in the book is that any cost-benefit analysis of incarceration has to start with the suffering that you're inflicting by putting somebody behind bars.
Hear, hear.
So no, I'm entirely with that. But having said that, if I know that of people released from prison, between a half and 2/3 are going to be back inside within 3 years, and I think I've got a program that'll cut that number something like in half, then why isn't it a central demand that everybody be included in that sort of program, even though it looks a little Clockwork Orange? The interesting thing, Pat Nolan has been effective in the Justice Fellowship, but he's also been very effective in going back to his old friends in conservative politics.
Yeah.
And hammering them on this. And one of the consequences of that was a meeting that was called by Newt Gingrich and Grover Norquist to set up a group called Right on Crime.
Right on Crime.
Right on Crime, which basically says, look, the mass incarceration is everything conservatives hate. It's wasteful government spending, it's excessive state power, it's the result of an iron triangle, it's inefficient government, we should do better than that. And there's now an organization and a masthead, and Ed Meese is on it, and Jeb Bush is on it.
Yeah, Pat talked about it when he was on the show last week.
It's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So far, they're a little short on elected officials, right? So this set of ideas.
I wonder why.
Well, so it's complicated. So this set of ideas is popular with some liberal politicians and some conservative foundations and academics. And liberal academics and foundations and conservative politicians don't want to touch it. I've got a lot of sympathy with what Nolan is up to. We're not 100% agreed. I'm not with the notion that anything that's a regulatory offense immediately shouldn't lead to incarceration. If you're dumping toxic waste in somebody's water supply, I don't see any reason why prison shouldn't be the response to that. But on most of this, we see completely eye to eye, and on the moral basis, we see entirely eye to eye. But I need people who share that set of convictions to be out there saying, yeah, and now let's do something about crime, because that's a big problem too.
Okay, Mark. I hear you, because I think that I'm one of the people that you need to be doing that. So you have advanced the ball with me in this conversation, and we'll
Terrific.
see what comes of it.
Always a great pleasure, Glenn.
Thanks a lot, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.